Hello and ni hao. This is the Caixin China Biz Roundup, broadcast every weekday from Beijing, with the essential news for everything you need to know about China and the world of business. Plus, a little bit more. I'm Joshua Dummer.
And I'm Gavin Cross.
Today is Wednesday, December 25th. Christmas Day. So we're going to try something a little bit different. Our editors at Caixin have suggested their favourite books of 2019 and have written reviews which you can read on the Caixin Global website. But we thought it might make a nice change of pace if we looked at some of the books today on the podcast instead of covering the usual news stories.
Which also might be quite useful for those of us who still need to buy some last-minute presents.
Dude, it's Christmas Day. How have you not bought all of your presents yet?
I'm just simply pointing out the utility of today's podcast format. This is a judgment-free zone, and I would prefer not to answer whether or not I have done all my Christmas shopping.
All right, okay, sure. No judgments here. But let's crack on. And the first book we're getting to feature is Extremism by J.M. Berger, and recommended by the big boss, editor-in-chief of Caixin Media, Wang Shuo. According to Wang Shuo, the book uses social identity theory to define extremism as anything that divides people into an us and a them, and assumes that the us must always remain hostile to the them. The author then offers an easy way to identify extremists. They are the people who think that, quote, we can never be extremists. Only the them can be extremists. He then categorizes different types of extremism and ranks them. He says the most difficult extremism to combat is racism, followed by religious extremism, which comes in second because it can allow for the possibility of conversion. And then there's ultranationalism, which is a group that cares most about which outsiders can and cannot join the we.
That sounds really interesting. And I'm not just saying that because our boss recommended it. As journalists, we use the term extremist all the time and don't give these terms the amount of attention we should. I think I might add that as a present to myself.
Ooh.
Next, I'm going to talk about a book recommended by Huang Shan, the associate managing editor at Caixin Media. So this book is written by Stephen Schwarzman called What It Takes: Lessons in the Pursuit of Excellence. It's an autobiography. Stephen Schwarzman is the well-known founder and CEO of Blackstone, one of the world's leading investment firms, and the book recounts how the path to success is rarely straight and often winding, with several detours along the way. Huang said he recommended the book because he felt it was very relevant to China due to the business startup culture here. In his review for the website, he wrote that, quote, here in China, we often describe startup founders as dogs who work on the clock. The difficulties and sometimes desperation are keywords even for those who turn out to be the most successful entrepreneurs and investors. But the key moments will appear in these times of desperation. The important message that stood out in the book for Huang Shan was the idea that people often only see the end results of an endeavor. So if you succeed, people see only the success. And if you fail, they see only the failure. Rarely do they see the turning points that could have taken you in a completely different direction. And, quoting Schwarzman, he writes, quote, it's at these inflection points that the most important lessons in business and life are learned.
So now, after two books in English, we're going to look at our first book written in Chinese. It is On the Judicial Power of the Final Adjudication of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region by Yi Saijian and recommended by Huang Shan again. Now, the title itself is a bit of a mouthful, for it's actually quite a short book. It's less than 200 pages long. And although it was first published back in 2013, I don't think you could find a timelier book on Hong Kong. It's basically about how the legal system of the Chinese mainland and the legal system of Hong Kong are built on completely different foundations, and how the two could potentially coexist. For the review, Huang Shan writes that the one country, two systems principle relies on continuous improvement of lawmaking processes and statutory interpretation under Hong Kong's basic law. The book asks some fundamental questions, such as how can the territory preserve its common law tradition and judicial independence in an executive-led political system? And also, who has the last say on the basic law? The top legislature in Beijing or Hong Kong's Court of Final Appeal? This has been a particular point of contention in the last few months, with a debate breaking out about who gets to decide the constitutionality of the anti-mask law passed recently. Another point that's particularly relevant 6 years after this book was still published: how should we contain political contestations within the framework of the basic law? Basically, if you want to zoom out of the daily news cycle of the Hong Kong protests and take a more long-term view, this book might well be for you. Huang writes that, quote, the author's insights into the role of Hong Kong's judiciary under one country, two systems provide context and perspective about the current gridlock in the city.
I appreciate that we're doing these book reviews, but next time can we do them a week or two before Christmas? I really need to add something to my list to Santa.
Next time.
Now, one of the things I found interesting about the list of book recommendations by Caixin's editors is that we obviously have a fair number of business books and books focusing on China, but 3 of the editors recommended books about Russia or countries previously in the Warsaw Pact. The book that jumped out to me, though, was The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union by Sergei Plokhy and recommended by Xu Hetian, Caixin Media's international news editor. At 544 pages, it's a weighty tome and looks at the end of the Cold War. All too often, books that look at this subject are framed in the narrative of triumph of the West. What this book seems to do is explore the moment-to-moment feelings of the people inside the Soviet Union during its last days. 2019 marks the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is an obvious reason why it made it onto the list, despite being published in 2017. In reviewing the book, Xu writes, "When celebrating the 30th anniversary of the end of the Cold War, we may not be surprised to see new tensions erupting along old fault lines if we look back to the clues presented by the very early days of the post-Cold War era."
That sounds really interesting. You know, I love that period of European history because it just feels so current, even though it happened decades ago. The last book review we're going to feature today is The Song Dynasty by Sterling Seagrave and recommended by the managing editor of Caixin Global and occasional podcast feature, Doug Young. Now, the book was actually written in 1986, but Doug recommended it because he says it was one of the first books he read when he came to Asia in the 1980s. The book recounts Chinese history through the lives of the 3 famous Song sisters, Ai Ling, Qingling, and Mei Ling. If you don't know who the Song sisters are, they were 3 of the most influential political figures in China in the first half of the 20th century. According to Doug, it's well written and researched, since the author is a former investigative journalist. Now, I know that Doug likes to read quite a lot about China and Chinese society, so if he's recommending a book which is over 30 years old, that means it's definitely stood the test of time, and it's definitely one to get your hands on. Now, we've only featured 5 of the books that the Caixin editors recommended, but you can read the full list on our website now. Obviously, any one of these books would make a perfect late Christmas present, Gavin, but if you're still struggling for the perfect gift, may I recommend a subscription to Caixin Global News Online? It's like the podcast, only with more insights, more comprehensive coverage, and more in-depth journalism.
And that is the gift that just keeps on giving.
It's an absolute bargain. Now, with that, we've come to the end of our Christmas special Caixin Daily Biz Roundup. Normal service will resume tomorrow. But for now, have a Merry Christmas and 圣诞节快乐.